Good morning. Before I begin, I just have to say it's great to see all of these photos up here. There's a story behind each and every one of those persons whose pictures are on display here. And of course, memories go with them for each of you who provided these photos. Thank you, and thank you, Susan, for facilitating this idea. Memorial Day typically marks the beginning of summer. School is out, or nearly out. We have snow-capped mountains all around us, the creeks and rivers are full, and wildflowers of all different colors are popping out everywhere. I love this time of year. Memorial Day is also a good day to spend just a few moments thinking about friends and loved ones, like the persons in all of these photos up here, who served or are currently serving in the military. There's a photo of my dad on this table. He was a pilot. He loved to fly and for the most part enjoyed his career with the United States Air Force. In 1967, Dad left my mom and his 5 small children to fulfill his obligation in Southeast Asia for a one-year tour of duty. He made it back after flying more than 100 combat missions over North Vietnam, and later wrote about his experiences, vivid memories which remained with him the rest of his life. In their later years, my parents were advocates for world peace. I still remember the prominent "War is not the answer" bumper sticker on their car, a fixture that was there until the day they died. And every Memorial Day, they always flew an American flag in front of their house. Nothing political, it was purely to honor the sacrifices of fallen service members, because some of them were friends, and some of them were family. I'm guessing most of our parents and grandparents knew people who went off to war in some far-off place, but never came home. My story this morning is one of those. Thankfully, my father survived his wartime experience and lived to see those 5 children grow up. So the story I'm going to share is more about my mother and my grandparents. It began over 100 years ago, with the latest chapter coming to a close only a few months ago in Normandy, France. I'd like to start this story by showing you a short clip from a documentary film just released by the American Battle Monuments Commission. This past year, the ABMC took a keen interest in my family story, and I think what they came up with in the film sets the stage nicely this morning.
There were 6 children altogether. William was the oldest, and my grandmother was the next oldest. She was pretty close to William. He was killed in 1918, fighting in the Meuse-Argonne. Our great-grandparents were asked, do you want William remains to come home to Minnesota? My great-grandparents said, no, the remains can stay in France. And so the ABMC cemetery was a place of closure. We would get a lot of questions saying, you know, you got to bring the remains home. You know, they're coming home. That was always the thing. You know, it was so important that the remains go home. When I said, no, they are home. I mean, you know, this is Omaha Beach. The fact that he was a D-Day casualty, that's not lost on us. I knew that these were people of my uncle's generation. It just seemed like the right place.
have the same tie on. This is my poppy tie. The poppy tie is famous from the poem In Flanders Fields, which represents an immense field of red poppies growing over soldiers' graves on the battlefield where they fell. It's quite a nice poem. And that was quite a day. There's also some footage from the actual interment ceremony that's pretty amazing. And I can't talk about the ceremony without mentioning, too, that Jeannie Moe flew over to France to join us for the ceremony and join our family as a witness with our family. And so I wanted to extend my appreciation, as always, to Jeannie. That short clip is from the hour-long documentary film Our Promise, which was created to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the American Battle Monuments Commission. The ABMC was established after World War I specifically to oversee the cemeteries in Europe for thousands of American soldiers who died in this war that was to end all wars. Never before in our country's short history had the U.S. been tasked with handling so many fatalities on foreign soil. While most of the World War I dead were repatriated to cemeteries in the United States, about 30% of the families agreed to have the remains of their sons, brothers, and husbands buried in Europe. That was the decision of my grandparents with their son, William Donnelly. I want to add that while I'm speaking this morning primarily about the impact of families of the American soldier, I don't want to diminish in any way the magnitude of loss at the global level. Between the two world wars in the 20th century, it is estimated that there were over 90 million deaths directly caused by the war, with well over half of those fatalities being civilians. They were awful wars in so many ways and for so many people. The Battle of the Meuse-Argonne in remote northeast France in 1918 was the final American battle of World War I. It was the bloodiest battle Americans have ever participated in. And when that battle ended, so did the war. Shortly before the armistice, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, a cemetery was carved out of this battlefield. Over the next few months, thousands of bodies were reinterred at the Meuse-Argonne burial ground from around the region. Despite the fact the Army at the time was rigidly segregated, the positioning of the burials had nothing to do with the soldiers' rank, nothing to do with their race, nor their creed. A very progressive idea at the time. A historian in this film stated it very well. There's kind of a democracy in death. In death, they are all equal. Today, that burial ground is the largest American cemetery on the European continent. In addition to William Donnelly, I have two other relatives buried there. Dick Corbin's great uncle is buried there, a connection we shared on a hike in the mountains recently. The Meuse-Argonne Cemetery has 14,246 headstones lying in perfect rows in an immaculately manicured facility covering an area only slightly larger than Lindley Park here in Bozeman. It's peaceful, but at the same time, it is sobering. Among these photos on the table of those who served is a picture of my grandmother, Mary Donnelly McGowan. It's the little tiny one. She's impeccably dressed and standing next to her brother's grave in the middle of the Meuse-Argonne cemetery. Throughout my journey of locating, identifying, and eventually burying the remains of her son, I thought about her a lot. She is yet another hero that I am thinking about on Memorial Day. Mary Donnelly married my grandfather Joe, an ambulance driver in wartime France. And when he returned to Minnesota in 1919, the following year, their son William was born, and later 2 daughters joined the family, including my mother. But as the children were growing up in their rural, peaceful Midwestern town, the world around them began to stir again. And by the early 1940s, this country was once again at war, a war that in the end would prove to be far worse than the last engagement. This time, 16 million Americans were called into service. Many went overseas to either the European or the Pacific war zones. 400,000 would lose their lives while in service. Exactly a year ago, during the Memorial Day weekend service here at UUFB, which Carolyn Woodman put together, I shared a special joy. The joy, oddly enough, was that my family and I were finally going to bury the remains of William McGowan later that summer. Joy is usually not a word associated with burying a relative, so I need to give a little background. Uncle Bill, as he was always referred to by my mother growing up, had been missing for nearly 75 years. His disappearance during the Second World War meant that my grandparents never really knew what happened to him. Wanting to know more, they made a trip to France after the war. I think they learned a lot, and I am sure the visit brought them some sense of closure and perhaps a sense of peace. During that same post-war visit to France to find out information about her son, they took the time to visit my grandmother's brother's grave at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. That was her in the black and white photo in the film at William Donnelly's gravesite, and that was my grandfather, and that was my mother that were standing with her. And I kept thinking, what was going through her mind? While working on my uncle's case with the U.S. government, I found myself constantly asking that question. First, my grandmother loses her 27-year-old brother in the First World War. Then she loses a 23-year-old son in the Second World War, a son that she had even named William after her deceased brother. Last year on Memorial Day, the local American Legion here in Bozeman dedicated a monument to Montana Gold Star families in Sunset Memorial Cemetery. And a quick history lesson on the Gold Star family. Starting in World War I, families of U.S. soldiers and sailors often flew flags that had a blue star for each member of the family that was serving in the military. If one of them died in battle, the blue star was then changed to a gold star. This continued through World War II, and although we may not see these star flags hanging in front of homes today, we still, sadly, have gold star families. The night before last year's Montana Gold Star Memorial dedication, I was invited to have dinner with Gold Star families who had traveled to Bozeman from all over the state. And it was a dinner that I will never forget. To my left was the mother of a soldier killed in the Middle East. Sitting across from me was the sister of a helicopter pilot shot down in Vietnam. And sitting right on my right side was another mother whose son was killed in Iraq and who'd taken time to travel to Bozeman from her farm in Polson. The gathering was clearly a support network for the Gold Star families, but it's an organization that no one ever anticipates being a part of. While I was intently listening to my table mates talk about their sons and brother, one of them asked me about my story. And it was somewhat apologetically, I explained that I had been invited to attend the dinner because I am descended from a Gold Star family. And I never knew the two family members killed in the line of duty. After sharing my story, a piece of which you just saw in the film clip, I realized that here I was sitting and talking to people who had experienced what my great-grandmother must have felt, and my mother, and of course, my grandmother, Mary, twice. These were folks who experienced pain, suffering, and eternal grief when the surprise visit to their front door, or a phone call, or a telegram explaining in some compassionate way that a family member was not coming home. That pain and that grief never goes away with a Gold Star family. My mother was just 12 years old when she first heard that her brother had been reported missing in action, and it was her mother that was the one that told her. My mom's most vivid memory of the conversation was that when her mother, my grandmother, told her about Bill, she did so with the confidence that he was still alive. He probably parachuted out and was probably still hiding in some French farmer's barn, she calmly told my mother. In some ways, I think a loved one missing in action can be harder on a family than knowing the truth. As it turned out, the plane that Bill was flying was shot down while strafing a heavily armed railroad station on D-Day, June 6, 1944. A lot of times when I talk about it, I carry a piece of his plane with me. And this is one of them right here. The railroad station was located just a few miles south of Omaha Beach and considered critical to take out of action in support of the thousands of Allied troops that were coming in landing on the Normandy beaches that day. A pilot who was flying on that same mission with him reported that Bill's plane was hit while just 500 feet above the station. The magnitude of the explosion following the crash combined with the resulting fire resulted in a classification that remains could not be recovered. With that official finding, Lieutenant McGowan's status was missing in action, a status, as I mentioned earlier, that lasted for more than 75 years. There would be no burial. Instead, his name was added to over 1,500 other names on the wall of the missing at the Normandy American Cemetery. Each name represents a soldier or a sailor whose remains were never recovered. In 2018, just 5 years ago, the U.S. government reopened Lieutenant McGowan's case, and late that summer conducted an extensive month-long archaeological site where it was believed the plane had crashed. Remains were recovered, but the investigators involved could only tell me that they were cautiously optimistic. There would be months of lab testing on the remains that had been recovered. And it was that following spring I got the call I had been waiting for. The remains found the previous summer were positively identified to be those of Lieutenant McGowan. Because of the global pandemic, we then had to wait, but it was worth it. This past July, Lieutenant McGowan was buried with full honors, military honors at the Normandy American Cemetery, just a few miles from where his plane crashed. To date, the ceremony we experienced remains the last burial at any of the 25 ABMC cemeteries that are located around the globe. It's not very often where a casualty from the First or Second World Wars is recovered, followed by the next of kin, that being me, decided to have their relatives buried overseas. About 30 members of his family, who are my family, were in attendance, including many representing our next generation. A woman who had witnessed Bill's plane crash near her house as a small child over 78 years earlier was also in attendance, along with her daughter. After taps had been played by a trumpeter in the distance, the flag was removed from the casket, carefully folded, and presented to Bill's youngest relative in attendance, my brother's 8-year-old granddaughter. It all seemed so fitting and so right. At the end of the ceremony, my oldest cousin placed a rosette next to Lieutenant McGowan's name on the wall of the missing, symbolizing that the soldier's remains have been recovered. For me, that was the defining moment of a long and emotional process for a family that lost a loved one so long ago. The Normandy American Cemetery has thousands of marble headstones lying in perfect rows on an immaculately landscaped property sitting high on a bluff with expansive views of the English Channel. And like the Meuse-Argonne, the cemetery is on the site of a battlefield. Just below the cemetery lie the sands of Omaha Beach, where on the same day Bill died, the day we know as D-Day, thousands of American soldiers came ashore as part of an Allied offensive that ultimately saw the end of the most devastating war in history. And that is my Memorial Day story. Just one of hundreds of thousands of Memorial Day stories that might help with our goal of a world community with peace and justice for all. May we continue to honor the sacrifices of our fallen service members and their families everywhere. And may we continue to recognize and appreciate the veterans who have served and continue to serve, like those in these photos, who we know, may they never be forgotten.